You don't have much to lose here, Claire. Let's just be honest about that. Those were the exact words my husband said to me across the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in October, a mug of coffee growing cold between his hands, our 14-year marriage sitting in the room like a third person neither of us wanted to acknowledge. He said it so calmly, so reasonably, like he was doing me a favor by spelling it out. I looked at him for a long moment. I didn't say anything. I just nodded slowly and told him I'd have my lawyer look over whatever his team put together. He smiled. Actually smiled. I drove to work that morning thinking about how strange it is, the way people see only what they expect to see. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 41 years old, and for the past 14 years I've been married to Marcus Webb, architect, third-generation Vancouver money, the kind of man who fills a room without trying and knows it. We met at a fundraiser for a heritage building restoration project in Gastown. He was charming and brilliant and so certain of himself that being near him felt, at the time, like standing in sunlight. I was 37 when we got married. I wore a dress I'd had altered twice and carried white peonies from a farm in the Fraser Valley. What Marcus knew about me when we married. I was a senior project manager at a mid-size environmental consulting firm. I drove a sensible Subaru Outback. I owned a modest condo in Mount Pleasant that I'd bought before we met and kept rented out after we moved into his place in Kitsilano. I split dinner bills. I never asked him to buy me anything. I did not talk about money. What Marcus did not know about me, everything else. I want to explain this, because I know how it sounds. I'm not someone who set out to deceive the person I married. The truth is more complicated than that, and I think most women who've ever been underestimated will understand it instantly. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. My mother was a nurse and my father drove for a mining company. We were not poor, but we were careful in the way that means you know exactly what things cost, you never assume anything is guaranteed, and you learn very early that displaying what you have only invites people to take it from you. My grandmother, who came to Canada from rural Newfoundland with almost nothing, used to say, "Keep your cards close and your head down until you know the table you're sitting at." I took that seriously. When I was 24, I inherited a small parcel of land in northern Ontario from my great-uncle, a man I'd met maybe a dozen times at family gatherings. The land was worth almost nothing when I received it, rocky, remote, and landlocked by Crown property on two sides. I paid the property taxes every year and forgot about it mostly. Then, when I was 29, a resource company came through looking to negotiate mineral exploration rights on properties in that corridor. I had a lawyer. They didn't expect me to. We negotiated for 18 months. I walked away with a settlement that would have made my grandmother drop her tea. I didn't tell anyone. Not my coworkers. Not my closest friends. Not my mother, until 2 years later. And when I met Marcus, I did not tell him either. Not because I was ashamed. Not because I didn't trust him, or at least not yet. But because I had watched what happened to people the moment others knew they had money. The conversations changed. The assumptions changed. Suddenly, you were a resource to be managed rather than a person to be known. I had spent my whole adult life being seen as a competent, capable woman who got where she was through her own effort. I didn't want to give that up. So I kept my financial life quiet. I moved my investments through a holding company I'd incorporated in my late 20s, on the advice of a financial planner in Toronto who remains one of the best decisions I've ever made. The Mount Pleasant condo became the first of 3 rental properties. The mineral rights settlement got reinvested, diversified, grown slowly and deliberately over more than a decade. I kept working, not because I had to, but because I genuinely liked my work and because a woman who works looks like exactly what I wanted to look like. Marcus knew about the rental properties. He knew about my salary. He knew I was, as he sometimes put it with a certain fond condescension, good with money for someone who didn't grow up with it. He did not know about the holding company. He did not know about the investment portfolio. He did not know that the total value of my assets, as of the September before he told me I didn't have much to lose, was just under $4.3 million. His net worth, which he referenced with some frequency over the course of our marriage, was approximately $600,000, not counting the Kitsilano house we shared, which was in both our names. I want to be fair to Marcus. In the early years, he was a good partner. He was attentive and funny, and took genuine interest in my work. The shift was gradual, the way these things usually are. somewhere around year 8 or 9. I noticed that his confidence had started curdling into something harder. He made more comments about my car. He started finishing my sentences at dinner parties. He once told a colleague of mine, with me standing right beside him, that I was much sharper than I seem at first. He thought this was a compliment. The conversations about separating started in the spring. They were calm, almost bureaucratic. We had no children. We had a shared house and 14 years of a life built together, but the emotional current had gone quiet between us, and I think we both knew it. I told him I agreed that separating was the right decision. He nodded. He said he was glad we were both being adults about it. Then he hired Mitchell Carver. Mitchell Carver is a family law specialist in Vancouver who is known, depending on who you ask, either as extremely thorough or genuinely ruthless. Marcus mentioned him almost casually over the phone one evening. I've brought someone on to help structure the division of assets, just to make sure everything's handled properly. He said it the way you'd mention hiring a plumber. I thanked him for letting me know. The proposal came 3 weeks later. It was 12 pages, single-spaced, and it had clearly been drafted with one central assumption: that I was the financially weaker party in this marriage. The framing throughout was protective of Marcus's assets, his firm, his projects in development, and his family property on Bowen Island, while assigning to me what could most charitably be described as a modest settlement. The Mount Pleasant condo, which by now had appreciated significantly, would be assessed at its original purchase value. My defined benefit pension from my employer would be split. Any assets held in my name in a corporate structure would be subject to full disclosure and potential division. Spousal support was referenced in one line and dismissed in the next. The document was thorough, professional, and built entirely on the premise that I was a salaried employee with a small rental property and not much else. I read it twice. Then I called my lawyer. Her name is Rosalind Park. She's been my personal legal counsel for 9 years. I'd worked with her through every stage of building the holding company, through the original mineral rights negotiation, through the structuring of all 3 investment properties. She is careful, methodical, and one of the few people who knows exactly what I'm worth. When I read her the summary of Marcus's proposal over the phone, there was a pause. Then, she said, very evenly, "Claire? They have no idea who they're dealing with." I told her to respond appropriately. I told her I wanted everything disclosed properly, everything documented correctly, and I wanted to be treated as what I am. I also told her that I did not want this to be cruel. I wasn't trying to destroy Marcus. I just wasn't going to let myself be erased. Rosalind filed our full disclosure response 6 weeks later. I will be honest with you. I did not feel triumphant during those 6 weeks. I felt tired, mostly. Tired and sad in the particular way that comes not from a sudden loss but from the slow recognition of how long something has been wrong. I thought about my grandmother's kitchen in Newfoundland, the checked oilcloth on the table, the way she could peel an apple in one continuous spiral without ever breaking the skin. I thought about all the years I'd spent making myself smaller in Marcus's presence, not dramatically, not consciously, but in the small daily ways. Agreeing when I didn't agree. Deferring, letting his version of things settle over me like a second coat of paint. I went to my therapist twice that week. Her name is Dr. Anita Mehta, and she works out of a clean, quiet office in Yaletown. She asked me what I was feeling, and I said I was feeling like someone who had spent 14 years being careful and was now being asked whether all that carefulness had been worth it. She asked what I thought. I said I wasn't sure yet. When Mitchell Carver's office received Rosalind's disclosure package, they requested a 2-week extension. Then another one. I was told, through Rosalind, that there had been some confusion about the assets listed under my holding company. This was, in the polite language of legal correspondence, an extraordinary understatement. Marcus called me directly on a Wednesday evening in January. He said he'd been reviewing the documents. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, something careful and recalibrated. The way people sound when they've just realized they've made a miscalculation and are buying time while they figure out how large it is. He said he hadn't realized the full picture. I said I was aware of that. He said he wished we had talked about this differently. I said I agreed, though I wasn't entirely sure the conversation had ever been available to us. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the dinner party where he told my colleague I was sharper than I seemed. I thought about the 12-page document with my pension treated like a consolation prize. I thought about the Tuesday morning in October when he told me I didn't have much to lose. I said, "I think you answered that question for me, Marcus." He didn't respond. I heard him set the phone down on a hard surface and I waited, and after a moment he said goodnight, quietly, and the call ended. The final settlement took 4 more months to negotiate. I will not walk you through every detail, because some of it is tedious and some of it is genuinely private, and that isn't the point. What I'll tell you is that the outcome was fair, properly, legally, documentably fair, which is the only kind of fair that holds. The Kitsilano house was assessed and divided equitably at current market value. My pension was handled correctly. My assets under the holding company were correctly identified as pre-relationship property and treated accordingly. Marcus received what he was entitled to and not a dollar more. His lawyer, to his credit, eventually managed the situation professionally once the actual numbers were on the table. I signed the final papers on a Friday in May. I drove back to the Mount Pleasant condo, which was now mine again, vacant, freshly painted by my tenant who'd just moved out, still smelling of new latex and old wood floors, and I sat on the floor of the empty living room with a cup of tea from the cafe downstairs and I let myself feel all of it. The grief. The relief. The strange lightness of a thing finally, completely done. There is a part of this story that some people might expect me to be angrier about, and I want to address it directly. The question of why I never told Marcus the truth in the first place. I've thought about this more carefully than I can explain. And here is what I've come to. I did not hide my wealth to control Marcus or protect against him specifically. I hid it because I had learned, long before I ever met him, that being a woman with money changes the way people relate to you in ways that are rarely simple or kind. I hid it because I valued being known for my work, my thinking, my presence, not my balance sheet. And I continued to hide it because, as the years went on and I watched how Marcus responded to any situation where his own financial position felt uncertain or challenged, some part of me understood that this particular man was not safe to tell. That's the part I wish I had seen sooner. Not that I had money, but that I already knew, somewhere below the surface of daily life, that he could not be trusted with the full truth of who I was. That knowledge lived in me for years before I let it reach the surface. I wish it hadn't taken 14 years to listen to it. The condo renovation took most of the summer. I did it properly, new kitchen, refinished floors. Better light fixtures, not because I needed to, but because it felt like an act of intention. This is mine. This is where I live now. I brought in plants and stacked books on shelves and hung the painting I'd bought at an artist's open studio in Strathcona that Marcus had always called interesting in the tone of voice that meant he didn't like it. I started going to a hiking group on Saturday mornings. Not to meet anyone. Genuinely just to be outside and moving, and among people who were looking at the same mountain. I met him in October. A year after that kitchen table conversation with Marcus. His name is Paul. He's a high school history teacher in Burnaby, divorced with a teenage daughter who he talks about with obvious and uncomplicated love. He has strong opinions about the BC ferry system and makes a genuinely excellent chili and laughed so hard at something I said on that first hike that he had to stop walking. I liked him immediately and tried not to make too much of it. We had coffee after the 3rd hike. Then dinner. Then another dinner. I was careful. I was more careful with him, probably, than I have been with anyone in my adult life, not because I was hiding anything, but because I had learned the difference between caution born of fear and caution born of care. I wanted to get this right. I wanted to know him before I complicated things. By the 5th time we got together a long Sunday walk along the seawall and then oysters at a place near the market, I realized I was going to have to tell him. Not because it was a confession or a test, but because I was starting to care about him and I didn't want to build anything on an incomplete foundation. I had learned where that led. I picked a quiet evening at my place. I made dinner. After we ate, I told him I wanted to share something about my financial situation that I hadn't mentioned yet, and that I hoped he'd hear it in the spirit in which I was telling it. He put down his wine glass and gave me his full attention and waited. I told him about the land, the mineral rights, the holding company, the properties. I told him the number. I watched his face carefully as I spoke. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said, "Okay." I said, "Okay?" He said, "I mean, I'm going to need a few minutes to recalibrate, because that's a lot to take in." But okay. Thank you for telling me. He paused. Can I ask you something? I said he could. He asked why I hadn't told people earlier in life, and I explained it as honestly as I could. My grandmother, Sudbury. The way being underestimated had become a kind of camouflage that I'd worn for so long it started to feel like skin. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he said he understood it, he thought, and that it made sense to him, and that he was glad I'd told him. He also said, very gently, that he hoped someday I'd feel like I didn't have to wear the camouflage around him. I looked at him across the table in my renovated kitchen with the good light fixtures and the painting Marcus had called interesting, and I felt something shift, not dramatically, the way it does in films, but quietly, in the way that things shift when they're real. I said I thought I already was starting to. We're taking things slowly. We go hiking most Saturdays. His daughter, who is 16 and studying for her provincial exams and has strong opinions about oat milk, has had dinner with us twice and declared my soup acceptable, which Paul says is high praise. I am not rushing anything. I have learned the particular value of not rushing. What I want to say, at the end of all this, is something that I don't think gets said clearly enough. There is nothing wrong with knowing what you have. There is nothing wrong with having worked for something and protecting it and not making it the opening line of your introduction to the world. Financial independence is not a secret to be ashamed of, and it is not a weapon, and it is not a trap. It is just a fact about your life, and you get to decide when, and how, and with whom you share it. What there is something wrong with is being in a room with someone who claims to love you and feeling, in your body, that the truth of who you are is not safe with them. That feeling is information. I wish I had trusted it sooner. I wish someone had told me clearly that safety in a partnership does not just mean physical safety or financial stability, it means being able to put the full weight of your real self on the table and know the table will hold. Marcus, as far as I know, is doing fine. He has a new project in development in North Vancouver. We have not spoken since the papers were signed. I hold no particular anger toward him. I hold, if I'm honest, something closer to a kind of sad clarity, the recognition that some people can only see in you what they've already decided to see. And no amount of disclosure will change that until they're ready to change it themselves. That is a lesson about him. It is also a lesson about the kinds of rooms I want to be in. I drove past the Kitsilano house once in the autumn, without planning to. The leaves were going gold along the boulevard. Someone had put new planters on the porch, terracotta with some kind of trailing green. I sat at the stoplight and looked at it for the length of the red and felt almost nothing, which, I have come to understand, is not emptiness. It's more like the particular quiet of a question you've finally stopped asking. The light changed. I drove to the market, bought 2 kinds of apple and a bunch of dahlias, and went home to my own kitchen, where the painting hung exactly where I'd put it.